our innovation class. Like you said, innovation is a big area. I wanted to launch this first day. I kind of wanted to think a little bit more pie in the sky, blue sky, about innovation and make it a little more personal. And so we have a speaker today who came to us from California and Canada. His name is Srini Rao. Srini is a good friend of mine who is the CEO of a media company called Unmistakable Media. He has an undergraduate degree in economics from Berkeley, so don't hold that against him. He's had a really interesting career doing a lot of different things, working in many, many parts of the high-tech sector, which he'll talk to you about. And now he is a professional speaker, writer, blogger, and podcaster. He's interviewed over 700 people, has 50,000 plus listeners to his podcast, and has a trove of information about innovation and creativity. So he's going to tell us about the relationship between the two until 12:45.
Great.
Thank you, Srini. And I'll put this up.
All right. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me here. It's always really enjoyable to speak to students, but particularly students here at Texas A&M, because I actually grew up in this town. I spent from 3rd to 9th grade here, and it's the first time I've been back in 25 years. I have a lot of memories of this campus, a first date in which I failed to kiss a girl, Kyle Field, and a bunch of other stuff. So I use the internet to make things, to connect people, to share ideas, and primarily to tell stories about people that I find insanely interesting, like this guy.
I wish there was an easy way to apply a formula or a general approach. The only thing I can say, as I said before, is that when I see people who seem to me contented in their lives, they had this leap at some point where they didn't know where the bottom was. It was dark, and it's the scariest thing in the world. But I think it's necessary a lot of the times, and you do have to erase things. And you have to go counter to societal expectations often. And sometimes you have to go counter to your own expectations. Things you told yourself would make you happy in your whole life, suddenly, maybe they don't make you happy anymore. Maybe it's not enough, and you have to be honest about it.
So Robert Curzon went to Harvard for law school. Within a few weeks of being there, he realized he hated Harvard Law School, but actually graduated, spent years working as a corporate attorney, then got himself a job at the Chicago Sun-Times as a data entry clerk outside of his job as a lawyer, and eventually ended up becoming a columnist where he covered sports and ended up becoming an author. And this is just one of the hundreds of stories I've told over the last 7, 8, 9 years. And what I want to talk to you about today is not just why creativity is the precursor to innovation, but share some observations from my own life and career post-MBA 10 years later that I wish somebody had shared with me when I was sitting in your shoes. So pretty early on in our lives, we start getting messages from the world around us, peers, parents, society, advertising. These are the colleges that you should apply to. These are the majors that you should think about. These are the careers that you should consider. And this is the definition of success. And over a long enough timeline, what ends up happening is that these messages become invisible scripts that dictate virtually every aspect of our lives and some of our most important decisions. And we make those decisions based not on lived experience, but based on other people's opinions until we just keep blindly choosing from the options that have been put in front of us. So I applied to business school in 2006. I wanted to work in media and entertainment, and by the spring of 2007, I got rejected from every single business school I applied to. So in a last-ditch effort, I applied to Pepperdine, who has much lower standards than this place or any of the other places that I applied to, and I knew I would get in. And I found myself in LA in the fall of 2007, and within a few weeks of being there, I got a rude awakening. Turns out that nobody hires MBAs to do creative work in the entertainment industry. And I wasn't interested in sitting around crunching spreadsheets to figure out how to make a Disney movie profitable. I wanted to be part of the creative process. So I shelved that dream, completely forgot about it. And the following summer, between my first and second year of business school, I ended up working at Intuit, where I was their social media intern. And in the universe's great gift to me, my boss at the end of the summer said, "We're not going to be making an offer. You didn't even do that good of a job, and we'd be doing you a huge disservice if we made you an offer." And I thought it was the worst thing in the world at the time, and it turns out it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Fast forward to April of 2009, when I graduated, and if any of you graduated undergrad at that time, you even remember this, it was a terrible time to get out of school, because we weren't just in a global economic recession. Almost overnight, we'd gone from being in an economy that had rewarded people for fitting in to now being in one that rewarded people for standing out. And all of a sudden, all the options that had been put in front of me my entire life were no longer there. And it forced me to start looking at the possibilities that surrounded me and sent me down this really unexpected trajectory of a career in which I became an author, speaker, and podcast host, and that's largely what has landed me here today. And when I look back at it, what I realized was, what I wish somebody had told me was that you shouldn't let the options in front of you blind you to the possibilities that surround you. Because everything we do in our lives, we're constantly just picking from the options that are put in front of us. Whether it's a degree program, whether it's a major, you're given a list. But we're never thought to ask, well, what if none of these options work for me? What if none of these are the things that I want? And as a result, we're blinded to the possibilities that surround us. The other thing I would encourage you to do is to choose the opportunity that gives you the most responsibility, not the one that necessarily looks the best on your resume or comes with the biggest paycheck. And I'll tell you why, because this opportunity will be worth a lot more in the long run. And I'll give you some context. So I, as Karuk mentioned, went to that other school across the bay from where he went to school, where people are smoking a lot more pot and doing a lot more drugs and up to a lot more mischief. And it was year 2000, the dot-com bubble had just burst. I got an internship in Silicon Valley that spring, and before I even started the summer internship, the investors pulled the funding. The CEO called me in, and he said, "We're really sorry, here's a check for $1,000 to compensate you for the inconvenience." So there's another lesson there, is that it's not just the job that you choose, but the boss that you choose. The boss that you choose can have a profound impact on the trajectory of your career. In fact, you'd be better off with a great boss and a lousy company than the other way around. And if you've never read Things a Little Birdie Told Me, which is Biz Stone, the co-founder of Twitter's book, he actually talks about the fact that his first boss had a profound impact on him ending up, being one of the co-founders of Twitter. So if that's not evidence for why you should choose the best boss, I don't know what is. But back to this idea of choosing the opportunity that gives you the most responsibility. So fast forward to the summer, I managed to finally secure a few interviews and get 2 offers. Young entrepreneur calls me to a coffee shop, says to me, "I can only pay you $10 an hour, but you're going to learn a ton, you'll have a lot of responsibility, you'll be my right-hand person." Another guy calls me and offers me an extra $15 an hour. And naturally, of course, I took the extra $15 an hour. I have the job that pays $25 an hour, working for a tyrant of a CEO who wants me to CC him on every email I send and micromanages my entire internship. And in the middle of the summer, that company ran out of money. And that young entrepreneur in the coffee shop who wanted to pay me $10 an hour ended up going on to found multiple companies in Silicon Valley that were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So an extra $15 an hour might have cost me a fortune. Now, obviously, there's no way that I could have known that at the time. But when you take the opportunity that gives you the most responsibility, that's the one that's going to rise in value over time. It's not going to just increase your current earnings, but it's going to increase your current earning potential over time. Because that's the one where you're going to develop the most skills, it'll give you the most career capital, and it'll give you the most leverage later on to parlay that into bigger and bigger opportunities. So let's get into this idea of why creativity is the precursor to innovation. And it really begins with something simple, and that is the idea of starting or building something. So I mentioned to you that I graduated in April of 2009, and in the limited number of interviews that I managed to get, one thing was becoming very clear. My resume was completely worthless. Because a resume is nothing more than things you claim you know how to do. It's not tangible evidence of the things you say you know how to do. And so I started one of my very first online projects. It was a job search campaign called 100 Reasons You Should Hire Me. And it was horribly executed. Classmates of mine emailed me to tell me how stupid it was. People had never talked to me the whole time I'd been at Pepperdine. I got hate mail from strangers on the internet. And then a couple of weeks after school ended, I ran into the biggest hurdle. I couldn't even come up with 100 reasons why anybody should hire me. So that was the end of that idea. But it was the beginning of starting things and building things, and it was the precursor to everything that came later on. And 25 years ago, when I was in college, it used to take thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours to do something as simple as build a website. And today you have nearly free, unlimited access to tools, resources, and distribution channels in a way that you never have before. If you want to publish a book, you don't need the permission of a publisher. You can publish it on Amazon. If you want to record a label, you can record your songs and upload them to iTunes. And this was not the case then. But there are a lot of other valuable things that come from this idea of starting something in addition to tangible evidence. It teaches you how to take action without waiting for somebody to tell you what to do. And if you work a job where you're waiting for somebody to tell you what to do, I can guarantee you that that job will be eliminated within a few years. Because if it's a job where somebody can tell you what to do, that's a job that can probably be automated. Not only that, it gives you an opportunity to express yourself. And I think humans have this deep need to create and express themselves. And when you deny yourself that, you deny yourself and the world some of your greatest gifts. And you are in an incredibly unique position to do this because you have the most valuable asset at your disposal, which is time. And time without the pressure of trying to figure out how this thing is going to succeed or be commercially successful. Even if it fails, it doesn't matter because you don't have to live off of this thing. And most people would kill for that kind of freedom. And it's something that I think I wasted while I was in business school. The other thing I want to encourage you to do is to start before you're ready. So we all have this mythical day in the future when we think that the conditions will be perfect, when we have enough money saved, when our kids are in college. And the problem is that that day never actually comes. It just ends up being an excuse to keep putting off this thing that you say you want to do or this thing that you say is so important to you. So a couple of months back, I was having dinner with a friend of mine who is the director of sales at a large memory company in Southern California. And he said, well, I don't get it. Why would anybody leave this safe and secure job to go start a company? Why not wait until you have enough money saved up and you've got your house paid off and all that? And I said, yeah, that sounds nice in theory, but I'm here because one of our friends died last week. He drowned in Mexico at age 37, so who says you're even going to make it to that? And aside from the sort of morbid idea of contemplating your own mortality, the author Seth Godin says the best way to be where you want to be a year from now and 10 years from now is to do something that today that you'll be glad you did. So there really is no perfect time to do anything. There's always going to be an excuse not to start or not to try this thing that you say that you want to do. And like I said, you're in a position where the downsides to your risks are actually quite low. Most of them are just perceived. So I want to talk a little bit about ideas. Nobody has a shortage of ideas. We just lack the discipline to capture them. Every one of you probably has ideas every single day. And so what I want to encourage each one of you to do is to buy yourselves a notebook and to literally just start capturing ideas. And I'll tell you why. First, you're going to have the freedom to have bad ideas. And everybody has bad ideas. You get to good ideas by having lots of bad ideas. And you will get into this habit and develop this muscle of coming up with ideas. I can trace back every piece of important work that I've done to the pages of a notebook. So sometime in 2016, I wrote a book with a publisher called Unmistakable Why Only is Better Than Best. 4 or 5 years before that, I wrote down an idea for a book, came up with an outline on how to use surfing, I'm an avid surfer, as a metaphor for life and business. And wrote an outline for a book deal, for a book that I didn't even know I was going to get a book deal for. And 4 years later, we ended up using that structure in a book. Ideas don't come to you on a really convenient timeline, as you've probably noticed. Sometimes they happen in the shower, sometimes when you're out for a run. And they don't show up fully formed often. Sometimes they're completely half-baked, like you don't know what they're going to be. And if you don't get into this discipline of capturing your ideas, you will never be able to capitalize on them. So let's talk about an idea called Little Bets. This is based on the work of an author named Peter Sims. So when you look at somebody like an Elon Musk or a Richard Branson or the things that you read about in the news, your first instinct is to believe that, okay, making these really big things happen takes massive risks where the downsides are massive. But if you actually look closer, it turns out that's anything but true. And basically what happens is these people take small risks where the losses are affordable that allow them to keep iterating. So anybody here seen Chris Rock on a national comedy tour, seen one of his specials on HBO? Okay. So what you might not know is that by the time you see Chris Rock on stage at a national comedy tour, all that material has been tested. He goes out to open mic nights and he bombs. And the reason he does that is because an open mic night is a low-stakes environment. If you pay $100 to see Chris Rock and he's not funny, you're going to be pissed off. If you go to an open mic night and Chris Rock shows up, you'll probably be like, holy shit, Chris Rock is here. But you're not expecting an amazing performance. And so what that allows him to do is to test that material so that by the time he hits a national comedy stage, everything is tested and he knows it's going to work. And so he's tested all of this in a super low-stakes environment. I'll give you another example. A couple years ago, my team at Unmistakable Creative and I planned an event. And conventional wisdom would tell you if you want to plan an event or a conference, you book a venue, you announce a city and location, and then you sell tickets. Now, unlike a wedding, which we've just been through, you don't have to you can't lose money on an event. You have to actually make money or not lose money. So we didn't actually do any of that. We put up a landing page and we collected email addresses, and we just kept building the email list. We basically told people it's going to be in LA so you can buy plane tickets. We didn't spend a dime on the venue until we knew we had sold enough tickets. That allowed us to mitigate all of our risk without necessarily putting ourselves in this sort of catastrophic situation. And if you look at the earliest versions of a lot of startups, they start with, in Silicon Valley, what they call a minimum viable product. So chances are many of you use DoorDash to order food. Sam Altman, who's the president of Y Combinator, made their curriculum for their CS 186 class at Stanford, where they teach all of this, available as a podcast and now as a YouTube channel. And they tell the story, the founder of DoorDash comes in and tells a story of how he built it. Just puts up a simple website with a phone number and a list of a few restaurant menus, and he's just walking around with some friends. He gets a personal phone call, thinking nothing of it, to his personal cell, and the guy says, "Hey, I saw your website. Can I order some food?" So the founder of DoorDash goes to the restaurant to pick up some Thai food while he's on his way to get some ice cream, and that's how DoorDash begins. With the most simple little bet imaginable, without spending a fortune and mitigating all of the risk that you might otherwise take. All right, so this probably is one of the most valuable things that I could share with you about innovation, and that is to look for a paradigm shift. So what do I mean by this? A couple of years ago, I interviewed an author named Julian Smith, who had one of the most popular blogs on the internet at the time. He's since gone on to found a startup called Breather, which is like Airbnb for office space. And one of the things he said to me in that conversation was that every time a new technology comes along, the question you have to ask yourself is, what does this make possible that wasn't before? What is the paradigm shift here? So let's look at this through a few different periods in history. In the early 90s, a young guy at University of Illinois named Mark Andreessen comes up with this thing called Mosaic, which becomes Netscape. Depending on how old you are, some of you might remember this. That's our first commercial web browser. The porn industry figures out how to charge your credit card. Fun fact, if you didn't know that, watch the movie Middlemen. And as a result, you get the convergence of a commercial web browser, the ability to process somebody's credit card, and the result is e-commerce. So suddenly now you have the ability to buy things online and charge people's credit cards. Two technologies converge together, make something that was possible, it wasn't possible before, now possible. Fast forward to 2008, Steve Jobs comes up with the iPhone. You get a combination of mobile devices and GPS, and that makes billions of dollars in innovation possible that weren't before. Lyft, Airbnb, Uber, DoorDash, everything that uses location and a mobile phone is suddenly now possible. Then you get Amazon Web Services, which is kind of somewhere in this timeline. And just for some context, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was an online photo sharing website called oPhoto. Pretty simple concept. It was just a place where you stored your photos, kind of like a Facebook photo album. It took $60 million in funding to build oPhoto. And today, one of you could build oPhoto sitting at your table over the weekend because of Amazon Web Services. So you get a combination of Amazon Web Services, WordPress, GitHub, Squarespace, and it makes just a world of things possible that weren't before at a fraction of the cost. Apps, blogs, podcasts, you can write apps without knowing how to put together a single line of code. You can build media properties within days. And we basically are moving into an era where suddenly to go from idea to execution is easier and faster than it's ever been at any other time in history. And then that brings us into the paradigm shift that we're going through right now, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning. And what that enables is automation of a lot of things that used to take a hell of a lot of time. So I'll give you a few different examples. First, if you've used any AI tools, if you used them a year or two ago, they were super clunky. If you tried to design a logo or any of this stuff, you'd see the thing that it would spit out and it would look terrible. Well, machine learning works based on data points. And the more data that you input into this thing, the better it gets. And now, after 2 years, these tools have had millions of data points put into them, and they're getting accurate in a way that's almost terrifying. So we do a custom album cover for every guest that we have on the Unmistakable Creative. And thanks to Adobe's new AI software that's embedded into Photoshop, we don't have somebody draw it anymore. We just trace it using an app from Adobe. The tool basically strips out all the fonts from our previous album covers, and we can save every background as a pattern. So what used to take an hour now takes a couple of minutes to do for our illustrator, all simply because of a little bit of AI. So I want to show you something that I made a couple of weeks ago using a whiteboarding tool. And it took me longer to figure out how to use the software than it did to actually make this. A couple of weeks before my sister's wedding, I decided to interview members of my family, and one of my cousins told me this really hilarious story about the process of an arranged marriage. So I stripped it out and I did a whiteboard animation of it. And like I said, I didn't draw any of this. I don't know how to draw. This took all maybe, like I said, it took a day, but now I could do the same thing in 40 minutes because I know how to use the software. Let me play this.
excited that, oh my God, somebody's showing interest in what I do or what I like and what I am capable of and things like that. And my mom was only talking about my eldest sister, like how she does nice knitting and whatnot. And she's like, okay, can you tell me something that Rama does? And my mom was like, I never paid attention, I guess. So it's funny that they never knew what are my good, super good qualities, but then so that got my attention. That okay, this guy is genuinely interested, and he is here for the good reason, kind of a thing. And it was very funny. There was a movie that released at that time, the Bollywood in 1998 of Shah Rukh Khan. I don't know if you've watched that. Yeah, so the Shah Rukh Khan is like meets Kajol, who's the heroine in the movie, and then Kajol is going in. Shah Rukh Khan says, if this girl really likes me, she will turn back and look at me. And he keeps saying, Palak, 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 and then she goes a few steps and she turns back and looks at him. And he says, yes. So my sister was like, see, if he goes there, walks out of the gate and he turns back, it means he really likes you because he wants to get another sneak peek of yours. I'm like, this is crazy, okay? So it was very funny. And so she walked out the gate and my sister was like, Palak, Palak, Palak. He really turned back. And she's like, this is happening, I'm telling you. Okay, this guy is very
So I think the major takeaway from that is not necessarily that you should go out and make animated shorts, but the thing is that we're at a point now where our tools are getting so good that the value of technical proficiency is declining while the value of imagination and creativity is increasing. It's no longer the value of knowing how to use this thing. It's what can you imagine creating with this tool? Like, what does this actually make possible? But there's also a paradox at play, right? It's easier than ever to go from idea to execution in record time, and yet Sam Altman, who's the president of Y Combinator, says that your greatest competitive advantage is a long-term view, which he defines as 10 years. And most people have this idea in their head that I'm going to go and build this startup, and I'm going to cash out in 3 years on some big exit, and then I'm going to sit on an island drinking cocktails with rainbows or with umbrellas in them. And that's just not the reality for most people. And so this is something that I would really encourage you to think about, is this idea of having a long-term view in whatever it is that you're working on, whether it's in a job or even on an entrepreneurial venture. The other thing I would say is that you should solve problems that matter to you, because it's really tempting to go out and to chase trends and to do what's hot in the market or do whatever you think investors are going to fund. But when you inevitably hit a roadblock and inevitably hit challenges, when things get difficult, because they will, if what you're working on doesn't matter to you, it will be a lot harder to continue and way easier to quit. So I really encourage you not just to chase trends, but to give some thought to why you're doing what you're doing and to make sure it's something that really, really matters to you. And then finally, one last thing I want to talk about, and that is this idea of how you measure your life. Chances are most of you are familiar with the work of Clayton Christensen, who wrote a book called The Innovator's Dilemma. He has another book called How Will You Measure Your Life, which was published in 2009, and I think that book is more relevant today than it was even then, because of the fact that we have so many different ways that we can quantify our lives with our lives on, likes on Facebook, fans on Instagram, followers on Twitter, size of your bank account, accolades on your resume, and all of those things are metrics that fluctuate. And if you measure your life with things that fluctuate, your happiness and well-being will fluctuate as well. I think for me over the last year, particularly because I've been through a situation with my sister getting married and spent a lot more time with my family, I started to see there's one thing that you can't really put a price on, and that's the time that you have with people who matter most to you, far more than anything that you're going to accomplish in your career. A couple of years ago, I interviewed the author Tim Ferriss. Chances are most of you probably know who Tim Ferriss is. Wrote a book called The 4-Hour Workweek, worth about $100 million, invested in multiple startups. And I asked him what it is that enables somebody to accumulate that level of wealth, because he's not only done it himself, but he's been surrounded by people who have. And what he said to me really surprised me, and I'll show this to you, and then I'll open up to questions.
What makes someone truly wealthy, I think, is a combination of not just achievement, because it's easy to default to racking up sort of feathers in the cap and more money and obsess on those types of measurables, by focusing as an A-type personality on achievement, right? Just doing more and earning more. The bigger challenge for people who are hardwired that way, and I'm certainly this way, is balancing that with appreciating what you have. If you don't appreciate what you have now, you will never appreciate what you get later. So what is the end goal of all of this? Achieving, and amassing. So I build in a gratitude practice and journaling in the morning, 3 things that I'm grateful for, and so on, to make a habit of present state awareness of things that I already have. Reach out to someone and express gratitude. Say thank you to someone that you haven't said thank you to in a long time or ever, right? It could be a childhood friend. It could be someone you went to college with you haven't talked to in 10 years. It could be a coworker you see every day. I would also put in that basket of rituals that I find very helpful. Every day doing something that you fear. Like every day, one thing, whatever it is. Approaching a cute girl and just saying hi. Could be that simple. Laying down in Starbucks. Having that uncomfortable conversation you've been putting off. Calling maybe a parent that you haven't, that you've grown a little distant from and saying, I love you, something really vulnerable like that. It could be any of these things. Like every day do one thing that makes you nervous, makes you fearful. And those tiny micro changes cumulatively can just produce monsters in the best way possible, like monsters of productivity, just breakout successes. It's the little things that we do repeatedly that make us focus on how to engineer those things, because there are recipes that work, and just model world-class performers who exemplify the characteristics that you have. And ideally, model people who not only have the success in a given field that you want, but also who have holistically the life that you want. Because you can find people with hundreds of millions of dollars who yell at their kids, whose wives or husbands hate them, who do a lot of drugs on the weekend or on the evenings just to live with themselves. You need to keep in mind what the total picture is. But what can you do if you missed it? I don't think it's too late. There are too many examples of people who start multi-million-dollar companies in their 50s and 60s who manifest this type of outsized, incredible success in multiple areas. I'm hoping to help people do the same thing. Where it's like, come on, if you're putting someone on a pedestal, it's not because they deserve to be on a pedestal, it's because you don't want to take the responsibility for the fact that the excuse you're giving is total BS. I've just seen too many outliers, too many seemingly freaks of nature do things that it turns out you can replicate with the right recipe.
So I'll take questions now. Yeah.
So actually my first question was regarding Tim Ferriss and how he looks for people that are great within certain aspects and then figures out what made them great.
Yeah.
What is your scope when you're doing your interviews?
So I don't necessarily look for what makes somebody great. I look for what makes them interesting. And sometimes, so I mean, you know, our guests have ranged from bank robbers to drug dealers to performance psychologists to entrepreneurs. To me, if somebody's story is interesting, that's the thing I'm always after, is what's fascinating about this person that is also probably potentially a story that nobody else has told. Yeah.
So you said, like, make little bets along your career. You mentioned, like, the lighting example, but, like, during your career, starting on Unstable Media,
Yeah.
what were some little bets you had to make along to start?
So I think in a lot of ways, I mean, the thing is, you know, one of the things I mentioned to you is how much cheaper it is to start anything nowadays. So everything, I mean, there are probably a dozen or so online projects and blogs that nobody ever saw that are probably, like, you know, out there on the internet somewhere that never saw the light of day. They just never got any traction. But the thing is, there was no cost to starting. It was practically free. It was like, oh, you bought the domain, you're out $10, you know, not the end of the world. Or you just realize this isn't the right idea for you. But part of it also is giving something enough time to see it actually generate a result. Like, this one thing I always, you know, I have a lot of clients who will come to me and want to start something like a project, and I'm like, okay, here's the deal. If you're not going to do this for 90 days, then I won't take you on as a client because it's pointless. So even, you know, I gave you the example of the event, but even with my own books, often what we'll do is say, okay, you know what, let's go throw up a landing page and see if anybody likes this idea. Like, does it strike a chord or resonate at all? My first book that I self-published that did really well, courtesy of Glenn Beck, which is a whole other story, literally the whole book was nothing but a bunch of really long Facebook status updates that I threw into a Word document, because the thing that I was able to do is I was able to test for resonance. I was like, okay, this thing clearly struck a chord with people based on the feedback. That makes it in the book. And so I just put a bunch of those together, and you get a self-published Wall Street Journal bestseller out of that. Totally accidental, but, you know, part of it was this little bet idea. And even the podcast, right? The podcast didn't start out in the form that it did now. It was literally a weekly series on another blog called Interviews with Up-and-Coming Bloggers. So each one of these things has just sort of been an iterative process. Yeah.
So the podcast, or at least the interview that you did here, it sounded a lot like Guy Raz, How I Built This podcast. So who did you use as influence?
Funny enough, so oddly enough, I listen to Guy Raz.
DoorDash too, and I know
Yeah.
he's done that one.
Yeah, so funny enough, I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, as weird as it is. It's not my preferred form of media consumption. I like reading books more than I like listening to podcasts, despite being the host of one. I listen to them in my car, but I do listen to Guy Raz. I've always looked at NPR as sort of the gold standard. I'm like, okay, these guys clearly know what they're doing. And to me, that's the standard I've always aimed for.
First, thank you for being here today.
Oh.
I actually attended the other school over there at St. Mary's College to get my bachelor's. So my question is about artificial intelligence and replacing human workforce. You mentioned that we have a job that we have to wait for someone to tell us what to do.
Yeah.
It's been gone a few years, and obviously artificial intelligence has taken over several jobs. People have talked about there being a tax on artificial intelligence that's, all of a sudden, okay, people are losing jobs, they're going to have to tax the artificial intelligence.
Right.
If that does happen theoretically, I think people are going to have a lot more free time. So what kind of education do you think would be most valuable to initiate the creativeness that you're talking about?
That's a really great question, and it's a good point. You're right. So, and part of it is that you come to school. This is, I think, one of the bigger challenges I had with an MBA is that I walked out of an MBA and I was like, oh, an MBA doesn't teach you anything about running a business. No offense, Kirk. It teaches you how to be an employee in somebody else's. And that's, unfortunately, the skill you leave. Like, I could give anybody from this program $100 grand and be like, go out and run a business, and most of you would probably run it into the ground because you've not run a business yet. In fact, running the business would be the most valuable thing you could do. So I think part of it is not just limiting yourself to what you're learning in the classroom, but actually seeking out other resources, reading outside of class, learning outside of class. I think that, to me, was one of the biggest wastes of my MBA, and I saw it over and over with students. I was like, if you're limiting yourself to only what's happening in class, you're wasting such a tremendous opportunity because you have, like I said, time, which is one of the greatest points of leverage, but there's so much more that you could be learning and doing outside of the classroom. So whatever the things are that make you curious. So give me just a sec. So one other thing I'll add to that as a caveat. So we have this idea of passion, right? Like you hear this in graduation speeches, and it makes nice self-help books and motivational speeches, but it's mostly bullshit because passion really follows engagement. It's like when you are immersed in something and you find something that you enjoy doing, that's how you find passion. You don't, you follow your curiosity, and as a result, you find your passion. So anything you're curious about, I think, is fair game. But I think that tinkering and trying things and building things and starting small little projects really is the way that I would go about adding to this, because I think that like I said, what you want to be able to do is go in and do things without anybody telling you what to do. Yeah.
So in your position now, like looking back on your MBA experience,
Yeah.
what do you feel like is the greatest value it added to you?
Well, I went to business school at Pepperdine, so I learned how to surf. It was a really expensive surf lesson. No, in all honesty, that generally, because it's as crazy as that sounds, that actually is the most valuable thing that came out of it. Because, as I mentioned, the first book that I wrote, surfing became the metaphor by which we organized the book. So it was a profound change in my life to go from never, having an athletic bone in my body, particularly because I grew up here in Texas, where there are 7th graders the size of grown men, which I learned on the football field at Anson Jones. I was like, this is not for me. I get the shit beat out of me on day one. And I was like, I stuck it out for the whole season. And for you guys who are from Texas, these summers with all that shit on you is not pleasant. Like, people are out there throwing up. Like, there's a reason this is a breeding ground for professional football players. That's not an easy thing to do. And as you might imagine, being Indian, I wasn't genetically predisposed for that. In all honesty, that is one of the most valuable things that came from it. And then the other thing is, I think the fact that it didn't go as planned. I think one of the things most people, and I'm guessing many of you, come into an MBA with is this idea of, okay, I know what I'm going to do here. I know what my goal is when I get out of here. I remember it was, I'm going to work in media entertainment. I'm going to have some hotshot middle manager job or whatever it is, and didn't go according to plan at all. So, and that was a gift. Yeah.
It sounds like you prioritize creativity over the things that you had expected to prioritize. How would you recommend us cultivating that now? As we do have grades that we have to
absolutely.
things like that we have concerns.
I think that you make it a small part of your life, even if it's just an hour a day. You know, I mean, it's not like I started out, because you got to remember, I did have a day job briefly after business school for about a year, but I spent an hour every day working on this thing. And most people, you know, it's been said, people underestimate what they could, you know, they overestimate what they could do in a day, but they underestimate what they could do in a year. And you're much better off doing something consistently rather than doing something with a lot of intensity just once or twice. Because if you do it consistently, numerous things happen. One, visible progress has been shown to be the greatest form of motivation. There's an amazing book called The Progress Principle that was written by a Harvard professor named Teresa Amabile. And visible progress can be anything, as simple as, okay, I showed up and did my 500 words of writing today. It's a matter of just showing yourself some mechanism that motivates you to keep going. That's one. Two, if you keep doing this thing consistently, you're going to get better at it. And when you start seeing the progress and you're motivated, you're also going to start to build momentum. So you basically have this just virtuous cycle of behavior, and it can be taken care of in like an hour a day. Personally, I think blogs and online projects are the easiest place to start because it's like a simple precursor. And even if nobody is reading it, the value of it is in getting yourself to do something on a regular basis. Because it teaches you, like I said, accountability. It teaches you all of these things that are just invaluable skills, and they're really kind of a lot of the intangibles that kind of catapult you in the workplace. So hopefully that helps. Yeah.
So I'm reading The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell right now.
Yeah.
And obviously with your podcast, with your books, you've gone through this whole process already.
Yeah.
So the question I have is just looking at the landscape right now.
Yeah.
And you're seeing digital ads, emailers. There's a lot of noise, and even more than that, people are paying less and less attention. Where an emailer used to be really, really valuable.
Yep.
9 times out of 10 it goes to the
Yeah.
stakeholder right now. What are the things that you do
Right.
to make sure that you actually get out there? And then even more than that, what do you think is the future? Like, where do you
Well, it's a good question because this is the central ethos of our entire brand. Like, that's the entire premise of the idea of creating things that are unmistakable, like things that stand out in a sea of noise. Well, one, I think that you shouldn't copy what you see work. That, to me, is just a recipe for pale imitation. Very rarely does anybody succeed by copying something that works. Another thing is, I think that aim to do things that are timeless, right? So take music as an example. I was just talking with Shannon on the podcast about this. Like, you know, the songs that Justin Bieber wrote 15, 20 years ago, yeah, they made him popular and they catapulted to the top of the charts, but most of us don't think about the songs that Justin Bieber wrote 20 years ago today. But then you look at, you know, U2 or Bob Dylan, like, you know, their songs have spanned decades. And that's because they weren't following this sort of formulaic ability to generate hits. And a lot of things, if you haven't read it, I think a good follow-up for A Tipping Point would be The Perennial Seller by my friend Ryan Holiday. Like, you look at movies like Shawshank. Most people don't know this. Shawshank didn't register in the theaters. It barely hit. Like, people didn't. I mean, do you remember watching Shawshank Redemption in theaters?
I don't think I was old enough to see.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, it didn't. You know, you basically it was and same thing with Fight Club, right? Got the DVD and it became a cult classic. And the thing is that if you're aiming to, like, you know, please an audience right off the bat or hit trends, then you run the likelihood of becoming irrelevant. Whereas if you're aiming to create something that's timeless, you have the ability to basically, you know, cut through the noise in that sense. So those are the two big things. And this is, you know, I mean, this is a rabbit hole of a question because I've spent like literally the last 10 years. This is what my work has all been about: is how do you get things to stand out? Part of it is trusting your instincts, right? Of, okay, what do I want to create? What do I want to see exist in the world? I mean, this whole visual aesthetic that you see was largely an accident. The only reason it exists is because I tried to teach myself how to draw for 30 days, documented the whole thing on Instagram, and realized I can't draw worth shit. But the thing is, from that moment, I started to see that, wait a minute, I may not be able to draw, but I can work with people who do to basically create things that I couldn't think of myself. So that's another thing, right, is looking for people who can fill in the gaps where you might have a vision for something, but you may not be able to execute that vision, and there are other people who can bridge that gap for you. So those three. Like, this is a question I wish there were a formula to, and if there's one thing I would say is that there is no formula to this answer. This is a rabbit hole that literally you could spend years exploring. But it's a great question, and it's probably the most important question you could have asked in this setting. Yeah.
We are out of time, but thank you, Srini. Thank you for coming.
Great.
You guys will get a survey, actually after each speaker. If you fill it out, you'll get extra credit for participating. And your questions, hand them down here.
Can we email like have the extra credit go towards the accounting portion?
Can you see the name of that?
Cool.
Oh, lunch club, whoever's